Hey everybody. This lecture is intended to fill in some gaps about emancipation and also about a few other important developments during the war that were happening, particularly after that last lecture had finished off in 1862. I think there's going to be some valuable information here that could help you out with your contextualization essays, as well as give you a sense of some pretty significant political developments that were happening during the Civil War era, political developments that have had a lasting impact in American public life. And to that end, I want to begin with a discussion of the Republican Party during the Civil War. As you remember, we had talked about this a few weeks ago. The Republican Party was a new political organization in the Civil War era. It had organized in 1854. It ran its first presidential candidate in 1856, and it represented Northern free labor and anti-slavery advocates. And then, of course, it's the party of Abraham Lincoln, and the party wins its first presidential election in 1860, and that's one of the precipitating causes of secession and the war. But the Republicans, despite representing only the North, were actually a pretty diverse party. They were a diverse coalition of different interests that came together to form this party. It's not like everybody who was Republican believed all the same things, or even lived in totally similar places, right? The North is big, and people's lives are very different from, say, Boston or Maine out to Cincinnati, out to Wisconsin. So the party contains, for example, the Free Soil Western farmers, as well as industrial manufacturers in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. The party contains finance capitalists in New York, and abolitionists in rural Michigan. Okay, so there's a lot of different perspectives that come together to form the Republican Party. And one of the real challenges that the party has throughout the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War, is keeping this coalition together, right? Keeping everybody on the same page so they support the party. One of the ways they did this was by gesturing to the ideas that all these different groups of people actually did share, right? And there were a few things that they all had in common. Anti-slavery is obviously a crucial shared value among Republicans. They don't all necessarily have the same exact perspective on what opposition to slavery should look like. There's radical abolitionists who believe in uncompensated ending slavery without compensation for slaveholders, and also then bringing formerly enslaved people into the political community of the United States, giving them the right to vote, making them free and equal citizens. There are others who advocate things like colonization, right? We should end slavery, we should pay slaveholders for the loss of property, and then formerly enslaved people should be resettled in Africa or the Caribbean or something like this, right? So that's a huge span of different ideas within the party, but there is a general opposition to slavery throughout. Another idea that's really common among Republicans is this concept that you could call a harmony of interests. Okay, Republicans believe, generally speaking, that labor and capital, agriculture and industry, that these different sectors of political and economic life are naturally in harmony with one another, right? They share the same interests, and public policy, right? The work of the government is to bring them together, to help them see what they have in common. Karl Marx, right? Who's the sort of ideological father of communism. He's alive at this time. He's a contemporary of the Civil War. And he wrote of it, he called this Yankee universalism, right? It's the ideal version. In the ideal version of this relationship, it's independent and free farmers are producing food, they're producing supplies, and they're sending those into cities, which are industrial places. And the cities in turn produce manufactured goods that can then improve life for the farmers, and they're also producing waste that the farmers can then repurpose into fertilizer, and you create this virtuous cycle of countryside and city. Because the city and the countryside exist in harmony, Republicans thought, then Americans won't need to depend on any foreign relationships, right? The United States can be a truly independent and interdependent place. To some extent, it's kind of similar to what we might think of as like the buy local movement of the past decade plus that we've seen, or calls for sustainability. And it also draws on nationalist thinking, right? How can you promote the interests of the nation through self-sufficiency and independence? So everyone under the Republican ideal is working to achieve this, and it's not going to look like the South, right? There's not going to be a profiteer who's earning all of the money while other people do the work and then is just sort of loafing, right? Everybody works, everybody's constantly working, and they have a shared goal. Again, this is just an ideal, right? This isn't necessarily something that Republicans ever actually achieve. The world is more complex than they imagined at the time, but it gives you a lens into what they wanted out of the world, right? What they thought was what they valued. So they come to power, right, in the Civil War era, and they begin trying to develop policies, even in the middle of the war, that will help achieve this harmony of interests. Republican policymakers during the Civil War demanded government investment in areas like scientific research, especially scientific agricultural research. How can we make farmers' lives easier? How can we help them make more money? Public education, and that's public education, especially again for farmers, to help them improve their methods, and infrastructural development. How can we just make this connection of countryside and city smoother, right? How can we truly create a functioning network of trade within the United States? One thing I want to say before I go on, we have talked about a few times in this class, and I've seen folks mention in the forum, and I've heard this my whole life learning about the Civil War, you have an industrial North and a rural South. But as you can tell by the things I'm saying here, the North was a rural place. It was populated almost entirely by farmers, right? And Republicans are a party of farmers. They're also a party of industrialists and some industrial workers and financiers, but they're largely composed of people who live in rural places from Maine and Vermont out to Iowa, and are concerned with the welfare of farmers. Okay. Let's see here. So another point you might see here is that Republicans have a more capacious view of government and its potential than other political organizations at the time had, right? In antebellum America, the federal government was much smaller and much less powerful than we expect the federal government to be in our own lives. And I think this has come up in a few of the discussions I've seen people talking about. For example, they're surprised that the federal government had no mechanism to identify unknown soldiers during the Civil War, right? Faust talks about this. Well, the government before the war just didn't have a lot of capacity. It didn't have a lot of money, and it didn't have a lot of power to go and do these things. And it probably wouldn't have occurred to most Americans at the time that it should. One of the things that makes the Republicans an interesting party in their own time is that they have a different view of federal power. They think that this is an untapped resource that it could do more to improve people's lives. Okay, what did the federal government actually do before the war? Well, it had a few kind of basic tasks. It collected duties on imports, right? So that's a tax, and that's about the only real tax that it levied. It delivered the mail. It removed native people from their homelands so that whites could profit from that land. Um, it conducted foreign policy, such as it was, and it was to some extent limited, certainly more limited than we anticipate based on what the federal government does in the 21st century. During the 1850s, it hunted fugitive slaves in the North, right? But aside from those things, the federal government is fairly small. It's a fairly small operation. So the Republicans come to power during the war, and they completely revolutionize the role of the federal government. This is a major outcome of the Civil War that is all too often overlooked. But like, as is the case with many wars in American history, governing power changed radically here. So what are some of the things that the Republicans did? Well, in order to support the war effort, in order to pay for it, they implement policies that support their social vision, like they create a Bureau of Internal Revenue, and they pass all sorts of new tax laws. Right? So they begin collecting taxes from people in ways they never had before. The IRS, which it's spring, so we're all going to have an encounter with the IRS if we haven't already this spring. The most beloved, I would say, of all federal agencies, of course, is a product of the Civil War era Republican Party. This Bureau of Internal Revenue later just changes its name to the Internal Revenue Service. Okay, so they create the taxing mechanism that really defines American life ever since. And the ways the government collects those taxes change over time, but this is the foundation. In addition to taxes, they sold war bonds to fund the war. And just for your information, this is a stunning statistic. The cost of the Civil War to the Union by 1863 was $2.5 million per day. Okay. This was more money than the federal government had spent in almost every decade before the war, right? In 10 years, the government was spending less than during the war it was spending in a single day. And so to find a way to pay for that, the federal government appoints a financier from Philadelphia named Jay Cook to orchestrate the program. And one consequence of this is that citizens become deeply invested in paying for the war, right? It's everyday citizens who buy these war bonds. So that means the national debt is spread widely across all the citizens of the North, not necessarily all, but a vast number of them, right? So you're bringing the population into the government. You're sharing power between the federal government and the mass of people. And it truly makes the war, in a sense, a kind of democratic effort. This is a surprising one, I think, for a lot of us. The Civil War era Republican Party nationalized paper currency. I would imagine most of you have not thought twice about the fact that you carry around these weird paper notes that the federal government says are worth something, right? Prior to the war, the privilege of making money was actually held by individual banks. So there were hundreds of different currencies floating around in the United States and antebellum America. And banks got that privilege from different states. The federal government was relatively removed from this whole process. So this is really significant for many reasons, right? But most importantly, it shows that Republicans were shifting Americans' confidence away from the local, right? The local bank or the state that you're in, and towards the national, right? You're saying you are an American. You're not just a citizen of Cincinnati, Ohio, right? And we know this because you have this paper dollar, and this is the thing that you say has value. This is one of the most controversial issues in 19th century America. Who prints money? What counts as money and what does not? And it remains a really important issue after the war, and there's a time when the federal government stops printing paper money and then begins again in the 20th century. We can talk about that a little bit more during the Reconstruction section of the course, but this is a very radical move for the Republicans to make during the war. Okay. I've heard a lot about tariffs. I know I'm talking about things that probably seem surprising. We're talking about this very dramatic war in this class, and suddenly here I am, I'm talking about taxes and paper dollars and things like this. But you have to imagine, to the average citizen of the United States in the 19th century, this is shocking stuff. It's really changing their relationship to the government. So what do they do with tariffs? A tariff, by the way, is just a tax on an imported good. It's a way for the government to generate revenue, but it's also a strategy for bolstering the economy within, in certain ways, bolstering the economy within your own borders, right? So you protect, say, the guy who manufactures candlesticks in New York from his competitor over in England who might undersell him. You raise the price on that good from England by attaching a tax to it. And now suddenly the candlestick makers in New York are just making a killing, right? So you're bolstering domestic industry. And that's what Republicans did with their tariff, right? It's not just about generating money, although it does that. It's about building up industry, which, by the way, if you're a political party, is a very nice thing, because suddenly you'll get all the candlestick makers to join your side, right? They're going to support your coalition because they know they're going to get protected by the Republicans. Okay. And this applies to all kinds of goods, right? It's clothing, it's furniture, it's building supplies. Basically anything that could be manufactured at the time is protected. What else do they do? They create a National Department of Agriculture, the USDA. The USDA is one of the most powerful federal agencies today. And it's like the IRS, a creation of the Civil War era Republican Party. And its job is to study agricultural practices and improve farmers' livelihoods. It doesn't really gain a lot of power until the years after the war. At first, it's sort of an idea, right? It's like getting its footing during the war, but they create it. And then it becomes a cabinet level department, meaning the chief of the Department of Agriculture is one of the members of the president's cabinet. That happens in the 1880s. But it's getting on its feet thanks to the Republicans. What else did they create? A whole system of public universities. And again, unsurprisingly, the purpose of these universities is to promote literacy and scientific agriculture, largely for the children of farmers. Some of the earliest colleges created under this law, it's called the Morrill Act, after its creator, Justin Morrill of Vermont. Some of the earliest colleges created under this law included Iowa State University, Kansas State, Penn State, the universities of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, Cornell University, right? These are big powerhouse universities still. Montana State University is a later addition to the system. So this is dramatically altering the role of the government in education all around the country. What else do? They pass legislation to create a transcontinental railroad. So they're linking the East and the West. This is that infrastructural development, connect those Western farmers to markets all the way back in Chicago and New York and Boston. Right? They're trying to bring the whole continent together, shrink the continent down with legislation. They pass, and we've talked a little bit about this elsewhere, they pass the Homestead Act, which is intended to encourage whites to settle Western lands and then improve it, which means turn the land into something that can produce profitable crops, right? Turn uncultivated land into commercial agricultural land. Along similar lines, and more successfully, the Homestead Act has sort of minimal success at first, and it ends up really serving profiteers who try to buy up all the land and then resell it. There's various other iterations of the Homestead Act up and through the 20th century, up into the early 1910s, that are a little bit more successful at actually getting people to settle the land. Along similar lines, though, with the goal of bringing the West under federal control, the Republican Congress creates all sorts of new territories: Colorado, Nevada, Dakota in 1861, Arizona, Idaho in 1863, Montana in 1864. Montana is a creation of the Civil War era Republican Party. I'll go back one. Just in these laws, right, creating the Western settlements and the railroads, what we're seeing here, and I hinted at this last time when I talked about the Dakota War, and I'm gonna dive into this much more deeply after spring break, but what we're seeing is the Republican Party is setting the United States on a very direct collision course with Native people in the far West, right? I've talked about this, as I said already, but Native people really exist in conflict with that Republican ideal of a harmony of interests. Because in the harmony of interests, the people who live on the land, the people who live in the countryside have to treat their land in a very specific way for the harmony to work, right? They have to produce marketable crops. They have to be sort of commercially minded people. Native people in the West don't necessarily share that commitment to commercialization of the landscape. They have a very different relationship with the land. They have very different ideas about what community is, what a harmony of interests looks like. And it doesn't have much to do with feeding the people of Chicago. It doesn't have much to do with feeding the people of New York City. So what we're going to see in the decades after the Civil War is a conflict in these worldviews, brought on in large part by Republican policy that's pushing people further into the West. And that is going to be unrelenting war. It's going to be privation. It's going to be dispossession. It's going to be a series of sort of unending horrors. So we see the Republicans have what you could say as this very socially, what you could see, I would say, as a very sort of socially minded, welfare-oriented approach to government. And as a perhaps unintended or perhaps intended, depending on the Republican we're talking about, consequence of that policy, we see war, violence, dispossession as potential outcomes, right? So it's on the one hand, there's a lot to really admire about the Civil War era Republicans, and there's also a lot that's worth criticizing, right? It's thinking very carefully about what this is actually going to lead to. Okay, there's one other big Republican policy that I haven't mentioned yet. You could say it's perhaps the biggest, perhaps the most important public policy in the history of the entire United States, which is, of course, emancipation. So let's focus on that for the rest of the lecture here. Emancipation is a policy of the government, but it's much more than that too, right? Because it requires the steady, intentional, very brave, very terrifying acts of enslaved people emancipating themselves, right? Emancipation is the most significant outcome of the Civil War, but it's also one of the more difficult processes to track because unlike most military turning points, which are sort of concentrated single events, okay, Gettysburg, 3 days, big thing happened, here's what changed. Emancipation is long, it's messy, it happens at a different rate depending on the place, and its outcomes vary from place to place, and it's occurring essentially every single day of the war, right? There isn't a day in the Civil War where emancipation isn't underway in one way or another. We read the piece last week about New Orleans, right? And enslaved people in New Orleans resisting their master's power in new and interesting ways, and eventually just sort of walking away, right? So that's emancipation, but it's happening in a one-on-one interaction between a slave-holding woman and an enslaved woman who have lived together for 20 years, right? So it's a little bit harder for us to grasp in all of its detail and complexity, and yet we have to try because it's the most important thing that happens in the war. Once the war broke out, enslaved people began fleeing immediately, right? It wasn't like they waited around for the federal government to give them the thumbs up. Um, this wasn't happening necessarily all through the South, right? But we see it in Virginia early on. There's a um, Union fortress, Fortress Monroe in Virginia, and enslaved people begin flowing into that in May of 1861. May, right? So just a couple of weeks, about 2+ weeks after Fort Sumter. The war has barely begun. This is before the first Battle of Bull Run. Enslaved people are beginning to recognize this is an opportunity, okay, and they are making themselves formerly enslaved people. Throughout the first year of the war, the official policy of the Union was called denial of asylum. Right, this is an era in the war where there is not a lot of clarity among Union policymakers about what this war is going to actually look like in practice. And so they play it very conservatively, and they have this policy that says any slave escaping into Union lines must be returned as long as the owner is still loyal to the Union. That's what denial of asylum was. Okay, so if your owner is loyal, you must be sent back. We saw this in action in one of the primary sources that we read. It was that Charlie Brewster document from a few weeks ago. You know, as I read some of your responses to that, it seemed like well, it seemed like people interpreted that in lots of different ways. But basically, what Brewster was saying was that he's furious at the idea, he and his compatriots, all of them are from Massachusetts, they were furious at the idea of sending formerly enslaved people back into slavery. But this policy, denial of asylum, mandated that. So in the end, Brewster actually himself was nearly court-martialed for refusing to send an enslaved black man back to his owner. And Brewster helps this man escape. He gives him a sense of direction. He says, here's where you need to go. Go now, or else you're going to get sent back. So what we see is denial of asylum turns into a real mess, where enlisted soldiers are in many cases unwilling to support it and actually facilitating enslaved people's escape. The policy was also unenforceable because so many people were coming into the camps, into Union camps, that there was no way really to track where they had come from. And also, if you have escaped slavery and someone says, is your owner loyal or not, there's not a great incentive to say, oh yeah, my owner is totally loyal to the Union, right? You don't need to know much about the details of this policy to say, my owner is not loyal, right? That's going to be a better answer for you. So what ends up happening, more than asylum being denied, is that Union generals just begin taking every enslaved person into camp and declaring them contraband of war, right? The rationale here is, look, under Southern law, under the law of the army that we're fighting, these people are property, which means they're enemy property. And we're at war with them. We have every right to seize this property under the rules of war, right? So it's emancipation under the rules of war here. All this is happening in the early years of the war. And by 1862, by the spring and into the summer of 1862, Congress, the Republican Congress, recognizes they really need to clarify their emancipation policy. And in fact, before Lincoln had ever issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Congress had issued several emancipation orders itself. In March of 1862, Congress overturns denial of asylum. Any escaped slave into Union lines now must be kept from their owner. They're never to be sent back, no matter if the owner is loyal or not. In April of 1862, Congress abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. This is something abolitionists had been demanding for decades, so this is a pretty significant and triumphant moment, but it's still sort of a conservative policy. Congress pays $300 per slave to the slave owners, so it's compensated, right? We don't want to lose the support of these slaveholders here in the district, so we'll pay them off. And then Congress also sets some money aside to potentially settle formerly enslaved people elsewhere outside of the US. So this is abolition, and it's also fairly conservative. It suggests the power of that anti-slavery but not abolitionist wing of the Republican Party that I mentioned before. In June, Congress abolished slavery forever in the Western territories. This is the whole cause of the war, right? If you remember the first 2 weeks of the class, we talked about the question of slavery in the West is the driving force of the whole Civil War. By June of 1862, Congress has answered the question. There will not be slavery in the Western territories. And then July of 1862, this is a very significant law called the Second Confiscation Act. This is the most important precursor to the Emancipation Proclamation. It explicitly freed the slaves of anybody supporting the Confederacy, whether or not the Union Army was nearby. It freed slaves even in the border states. Okay, as long as a master was believed to support the rebellion, their slaves were free. So this is an aggressive move. What we're seeing here in 1862 is Congress, with the backing of Lincoln, right? Lincoln is the leader of this party after all, is taking steps towards emancipation and then beginning to really make the abolition of slavery a war aim. Okay, so that brings us to the big guy himself here. We've read a lot about enslaved people's perspectives, and that's by design. Those are the voices that I want on the table in any discussion. But it's also important to consider Lincoln himself. Lincoln is the most important symbolic figure in American history. Everybody uses Lincoln as a symbol of something, right? Of an idea, of an ideology. Even when ideas and ideologies conflict with one another, both sides will tend to find a way to fit Lincoln into their story and show that they are on his side, or he would be on their side, right? That's fine. It makes sense. If you're going to choose a symbol, I'm all for someone choosing Abraham Lincoln as their symbol. He's an admirable figure in American history to choose. But he's not a simple guy, right? He can't easily be pigeonholed into one ideology or another. He's very complex. You could say there's sort of a duality to Abraham Lincoln. On one hand, he's this awkward, sort of folksy, homespun man of the frontier, born in Kentucky, born in a slave state, comes of age in Indiana and Illinois when these are the frontier, right? On the other hand, he is a political genius, perhaps the greatest political genius in American history. He is the great emancipator. He is the moral center, still today, to a significant extent, the moral center of American life. But these are like huge characterizations, right? They don't actually, have you ever met someone and said like, oh, that person is kind of like the moral center of like, no, right? These aren't really the ways you describe an actual living human who's complex. So who was Lincoln really, right? Aside from his big symbolic power, who was this guy? For one, Lincoln was not best described as an abolitionist. He had alliances with abolitionists, and he knew abolitionists in his life, but he also had some contempt for radicalism as a political style, right? He thought radical abolitionists were impractical. He thought that they would never achieve their goals, that in the end they might make it actually harder for others to achieve their goals. And yet he was deeply, deeply opposed to slavery. and especially from 1862 forward, he, more than any single individual, dismantled Southern slavery, right? So what do we make of all of this? I think someone else's perspective on Lincoln is the best, right? This is the historian and sociologist W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois is one of the great intellectuals of 20th century America. He's also one of the great icons in African American history. And he captured the essence of Lincoln very effectively back in 1922. At this point, Du Bois is living in an age of Confederate romanticism. A lot of the monuments to the Confederacy that we see today were not built in the 1860s or 1870s. They were actually constructed by the grandchildren of the Confederates in the early 20th century. So Du Bois, who is an extremely thoughtful and persistent critic of the culture around him, is seeing all of this kind of happy, romantic remembrance of the Confederacy, and in particular of Robert E. Lee. And so he looks towards Lincoln for a sort of different perspective on the history of the era. Here's what he said about Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a Southern poor white of illegitimate birth, poorly educated, and unusually ugly, awkward, ill-dressed. He liked smutty stories and was a politician down to his toes. Aristocrats, Jeff Davis, that's the president of the Confederacy, Seward, right, this is Lincoln's Secretary of State and one-time rival for the presidency, and their ilk despised him, right? This is what we might say the coastal elite, right? The elite, the old-fashioned, the wealthy of American politics despised him. And indeed, he had little outwardly that compelled respect. But in that curious human way, he was big inside. He had reserves and depths. And when habit and convention were torn away, there was something left to Lincoln, right? When the society, this is what Du Bois is saying here, when the society as it was understood was demolished, and it was. In 1861, the world as everyone knew it was over, and a new world was there to be built, perhaps, right? Lincoln had something left, right? Nothing, though, was left to most of his contemners. Those people who held Lincoln in contempt, who thought they were better than him, who thought they understood which way the wind blew at any given moment, who held themselves above others in the society, they had nothing to offer in the great moment when all convention and habit had disappeared. There was something left, so that at the crisis, he was big enough to be inconsistent, cruel, merciful, peace-loving, a fighter, despising Negroes, right? Lincoln is, at many points in his writing, he's racist, right? He expresses racist opinions throughout his life, despising Negroes and letting them fight and vote. The most radical moves in the history of the United States for racial equality at that point. Protecting slavery and freeing slaves. He was a man. He was a big, inconsistent, brave man. Right? So Du Bois admires Lincoln because he's willing to be inconsistent. He's willing to change. He's willing to grow. He's willing to do all kinds of different things, even if they seem contradictory, depending on what the situation demanded, right? And among those things, as Du Bois was very aware, was radical, racially egalitarian measures, like allowing formerly enslaved men, thousands and thousands and thousands of men who were slaves in 1861 when the war broke out, to pick up guns and go and kill Confederates. This is a radical move. We see the contradiction all through Lincoln's career. 1837, he's one of only 2 members of the Illinois legislature to vote against a resolution declaring the right of slave ownership in Illinois. Okay. 1847, he has 1 term in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's during the Mexican-American War, and it's there that he encounters the slave auctions of Washington, D.C., and he writes, "There is no moral basis for slavery. There is no negotiating with this." 1850, he supports the Compromise of 1850 that leads to the Fugitive Slave Law, right? And at various points throughout the 1850s, he says, perhaps we could compensate slaveholders for emancipation. He wants to end slavery, but perhaps we can pay them off. At various points, he advocates colonization. He imagines there could not possibly be a place for African Americans in our society, so perhaps we could send them back to Africa or the Caribbean or to Central America, right? So he's so hard to characterize, he's so hard to pigeonhole, which makes it interesting that he's the most commonly used symbol in our own politics, because the man resists such easy characterization. At the war's outset, Lincoln is considering an emancipation policy. He's meeting with representatives from the border states of Delaware and Kentucky, and he wants them to begin gradual emancipation. What he's saying is, look, it'll take 35 years. All right, we'll go into the 20th century, into the 1900s, and you can still have your slaves, but it'll slowly die out. That's the policy that he envisions. He's desperate to work out a compromise, but he also recognizes the direction has to be towards emancipation. Those delegates from those states, by the way, obviously they say no. They think it's going to drive their states into the Confederacy, and they say we can't do it. We can't bring that home. For Lincoln, emancipation is always a question of military strategy, of political expediency, of meeting the political challenge of the moment, right? And of morality. It's all those things at once. And sometimes those things clash with one another. We see this most clearly in a very famous letter. Lincoln was famous for writing public letters. So he would send a letter that seemed like it was meant to be private, but then it would get published somewhere, right? So he writes a letter to Horace Greeley. He's an editor in New York. Horace Greeley is one of the most important voices in the media during the Civil War. And he's critical, he's an abolitionist, and he's critical of Lincoln for not making a strong move towards emancipation. So Lincoln sends Greeley this letter in 1862. And he knows, by the way, as he's writing this, he knows that the Emancipation Proclamation is coming. He's already written a draft of it. Here's what he says. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. Okay. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them, right? So people who would destroy the Union to save slavery, people who would destroy the Union to end slavery, I disagree with both of them, right? So he's saying, my only purpose, my only concern, preserve the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. Those are secondary concerns, he's saying. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Okay, so what is he doing here? Well, the most obvious interpretation would be to say, oh, all this guy cares about is saving the Union, right? He really doesn't care about slavery at all. It's clearly not a priority of his. It's a secondary issue. Perhaps he'll get to it only if it helps. Yeah, he's sort of saying that. I mean, he's very clearly saying that. But Lincoln's crafty. He's very strategic. And he's writing the Emancipation Proclamation at the same time that he writes this letter to Greeley. So another way to think about this very famous letter is that Lincoln is preparing to justify emancipation. He's preparing the audience. He's telling the entire nation, if I do embrace a policy of emancipation, I am doing it because it will save the Union. And that is a politically popular move, right? He knows he can't be seen to only want to wage the war just to end slavery. There's not going to be enough political support in the North to do that. Northern white families on the whole aren't going to be interested in their sons dying just for that cause. But if he can do the work of linking emancipation and union together, right, and creating a new country out of that relationship, entirely free United States, then that's what he's going to do. And that's what he's trying to do in this letter. Okay, he's preparing the political ground, you could say, for what's coming. And he knows what's coming is emancipation. As if to kind of tip his hand a little bit, he finishes the letter like this. He writes, I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, right? He's saying, look, I'm the president of the United States. This is what I have to do. But then he says this, and I intend no modification of my often expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. This is a really significant symbolic move. The president is saying, I have official duties and obligations that limit my ability to make choices here, but I am putting myself on the side of ending slavery. Okay. So he's really shown his audience, especially clever readers who look at this document, okay, he is linking emancipation and union, and he's also clearly expressing his opposition to slavery. He, as I said in the last lecture, right after the Battle of Antietam, he issued, which is in September, so it's about a month after that letter to Horace Greeley, he issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And then on January 1st, 1863, a couple months later, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation itself. And it is a terribly important document, one that I think is all too often written off for what it didn't accomplish, which is fine and that's important. But if you think historically and you're imagining this document in its own moment, it's a very, very important work of executive authority, right? The Emancipation Proclamation declares that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be forever free, right? If you are a slave in a place where the citizens of that state, the white citizens, are in rebellion against our government, you are now free. So it's sort of a theoretical move because the Union doesn't have necessarily the power to instantaneously make that freedom real. But it's essentially saying, when it becomes feasible, all enslaved people in rebel territory are free. And it commits the federal government to including the military and naval authority thereof to ensuring emancipation. Emancipation is now a goal of the United States military, and the military will work towards that goal. As you probably know, this is a limited proclamation. It didn't free as many slaves as the Second Confiscation Act, which had been issued in the summer of 1862. It was already in force. It only applied to rebellious slave states, not to border states. It did not apply to regions under control of the Union Army like New Orleans, like most of Tennessee. But here's the thing, okay? Yes, it had limited applicability. Lincoln understood this well, though, and many other people at the time understood this well. Almost nobody cared, and certainly few enslaved people cared about the details of the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, the President of the United States has committed his government to ending slavery. That's all you need to know if you're an enslaved person on the ground in the Confederacy, right? Every step of the US military going forward is going to be a liberating step, okay? In response to the proclamation, enslaved people, they get the word. They know what this means. And that process of self-emancipation that I've been talking about, that intensifies rapidly after January 1st, 1863. Many white Southerners had never heard of the Emancipation Proclamation until they heard about it from their own slaves, right? So the word gets around. Enslaved people are communicating that this has happened. They're doing it discreetly, they're doing it strategically, and they are using that knowledge to get themselves out of slavery. What else did it do? The Emancipation Proclamation commits the United States government in the eyes of the world to ending slavery. There's a danger throughout the war, danger from the perspective of the Union, that the British will come and side with the Confederacy. But Britain is home to a lot of abolitionists, a lot of anti-slavery advocates. It has a long anti-slavery tradition going back to the 18th century. And now the British government is really hamstrung. It's going to make it more politically challenging to support the Confederates if the Union is clearly an anti-slavery army. This is if this is a war of liberation as opposed to just a war of conquest. The proclamation authorizes a formal process of recruiting black men into the Union. What is a result of that? 10% of total Union forces in the Civil War, that's about 180,000 men, were black, right? And that's made possible by this proclamation. So you enlarge the size of your military by 10%. 80% of those men, so 8% of the Union military, is former slaves, right? You now have taken a huge portion of the Southern population and made them part of your military, right? So it's a really brilliant and powerful strategic move, and also a wildly controversial one, but one that in the end is very successful. Crucially, emancipation transforms, this is so important, just transforms the purpose of the war. It's no longer for the Union simply about preserving Union, right? What Lincoln was saying to Horace Greeley, it is now unquestionably a war on the South's fundamental social and economic institutions, and the war can now only end in the unconditional surrender of the South and the destruction of slavery. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation promises. So it's easy to write it off because of its limitations. I think it's probably overzealous to write it off. It is incredibly significant, and probably the most significant Republican policy of the war, right up until the Republican Congress passes the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery in January of 1865. Okay. One thing I want to say, just really quickly, before I wrap up here, I think it's easy to overlook the basic, it's too easy and wrong to overlook the individuality and the really basic humanity of enslaved people who are emancipating themselves during the war. I think sometimes we get too wrapped up in thinking of slaves as this kind of undifferentiated mass, right? Who aren't free and then suddenly are free. And and no one knows what to do with them, and now they have a hard time after slavery has ended, and it's all just a sad and tragic tale. I think it's so much more complicated than that, and it becomes complicated when you recognize that enslaved people were just real people. They had names. They have families. Many of them have families that have been bought and sold far away from them, and they need to go and find those people. They have incredibly deep fears for their own safety, for their futures. They have insecurities. And yet, despite all of these things, they take these enormous risks, emboldened by the Emancipation Proclamation, simply emboldened by the fact that there is a war happening. They take these enormous risks to escape, to go out into the southern countryside and find their way to freedom. And then, more than anything else that they do after the war, they dedicate themselves to tracking family down, to building new communities, right? They build public schools, they build churches. I'm going to talk more about this in my Reconstruction lecture, but they commit themselves fully to building a life in freedom, a life based on the things that were held from them as enslaved people. They commit themselves to earning livelihoods and preventing their own exploitation. Enslaved people were often, formerly enslaved people, were often subject to great violence. They were often subject to exploitation. They were not only those things, though. They also were able to build real lives in freedom for themselves. And they do have power, and they exercise that power. And again, I'm going to talk in great detail about that. So emancipation makes possible this new political entity, the formerly enslaved, and they have this entrance into Southern politics, and they wield their power. They do. They are not simply victims. Okay, let's just talk quickly about some military developments at the end of the war. I try to just keep you abreast of a few kind of a bit of the timeline of what's happening in the war. In the last lecture, I talked a lot about battles. In this one, I really haven't talked about them at all, but a few things that are going on. I'll just do this in like 2 minutes. First 6 or 7 months of 1863, the big development that's happening is that formerly enslaved men are joining the Union military. Ulysses S. Grant, I mentioned this in the last lecture, he had begun to prophesize after Shiloh in 1862 that the war is going to be one of total mobilization, total conquest. This is a zero-sum effort now. And he's proven correct in 1863. The war is not going to end soon. The war won't end without some pretty profound violence and conquest. And black soldiers are going to be an important part of that, right? We read this a bit in Faust. When Confederates encounter black soldiers in the field, the stakes of the war for them change in many ways, and they are much less merciful. They are totally merciless, in fact, to black soldiers. That is a complete war on the Southern way of life by having Northern black soldiers. In the spring of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts is assembling. By May, they're going to march down to South Carolina. Most of them will be killed in July, storming a fort outside of Charleston. This is the subject of the film Glory, if you ever saw it. And if you haven't, you must go see it as quickly as possible. Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman. It's an amazing movie. In May of 1863, there is a battle in Virginia, Chancellorsville. This is one of the most important Confederate victories of the war. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crushes Union advance, and from there begins to march north again. Remember, they were stopped at Antietam the year before. Lee really wants to bring his army into the north, and he does it. His army invades Pennsylvania, and in July of 1863, he encounters the Army of the Potomac, the Union, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. From July 2nd to 4th, these are 3 days. This is the largest battle of the war. It's actually the bloodiest single event in the history of the Western Hemisphere, the bloodiest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. 56,000 soldiers are killed and wounded. It stops Lee's invasion. It is a major Union victory. At the same time, on the final day of the battle, about 1,000 miles away in Vicksburg, Mississippi, Ulysses S. Grant leads a Union victory over the city of Vicksburg, crushes the Confederate defenses there. Vicksburg's on the Mississippi River, and this is the last great battle of the Mississippi River. From there on, the Union controls the entire river and has essentially broken the Confederacy into two separate regions. So that first week of July is one of the most important turning points in the war, but the war is still far from over. And actually, much of the bloodiest fighting in the war is to come in Virginia in 1864 as Ulysses S. Grant takes over there. I'll talk a bit about that in the next lecture. That's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your patience in getting this lecture posted. Happy to discuss any of it with you whenever you'd like. Thank you.